I worked in a cemetery that was built on the grounds of a carriage house that burned down, taking at least one human and some horses with it. There was also a pauper's grave of unknown remains, transplanted from a tiny rural graveyard. One Saturday, I was on duty and very, very aware of the male shadow figure who lurked around the office. You could hear him walking with a cane, up and down the hall. It always put me on edge. He felt ominous and disquieting. I had a burial that day, and the family no-showed. Later on, I swore I heard someone in the lobby down the hall from my office, but when I got there, they were gone. I assumed it was the family and rushed out to find them. We played Ring Around the Rosies, with a huge funeral home between us. Finally, I realized there were no cars in the lot besides mine, and I hadn't caught a glimpse of someone just rounding a corner since a lap ago. Perhaps they left? Later on, I was in the giant vault that doubled as our records room. When my back was turned, the door slammed shut. It could only be opened with a key from the inside. Guess what wasn't on me? My cell phone. Panic took a while to set in, and no matter what I did, I couldn't get the door open. Meanwhile, I could distinctly hear a man chuckling outside. Sitting against the door, calculating how many hours until Monday arrived, and the likelihood of the grounds guys coming into the lobby and seeing the normally open vault door closed, I tried to calm down. Before I could talk myself really off the deep end, the door suddenly bolted open, and I flopped back, knocking myself out on the metal threshold. Hours later, I woke up to the sound of a dull shuffle step near my ear, which was oddly startling. Or maybe it was the sudden whiff of the familiar leathery cologne that inexplicably lingered in clouds around the building. Either way, I wasted no time in locking up and leaving. A few years ago, my boyfriend and I decided to take a spontaneous little trip one night to a supposed haunted road that's just outside our city. There's a bridge on the same road with underlying train tracks that is said to be the most paranormal part of the area, as a witch from the late 1800s supposedly hung her 3 children and then herself from this bridge. Sometime after, a school bus flew off the bridge, killing all its passengers. It is said that if you park your car in neutral in the middle of the bridge, you will be pushed across to safety, as the children don't want what happened to them to happen to you. We waited in the middle of the bridge for several minutes until we started inching forward in his lifted Jeep. I was both shocked and scared, and full of adrenaline, that I told him to turn around and come back, because I didn't possibly think it could happen a second time. Almost instantly, there were noises coming from underneath the Jeep, rattling and sounding like someone was messing with something. After a few moments of rattling, the sound moved to the back by the license plate. This time, it was obnoxiously loud and sounded like someone was both scraping and banging a license plate or something of the sort against the back of his vehicle. I wanted to tell him to leave in this moment, but my body was too frozen to speak or move. We both sat in complete shock as we listened to this horrendous noise slowly make its way up the passenger side rear door and then, without stopping, reaching the front passenger door where I was sitting. Instant silence. It was looking at me. It was staring at me for a good few seconds before I both felt and heard the knock of something on the door, which my thigh was leaning against. I practically jumped into my boyfriend's lap, and he told me he had heard it too. It felt like the size of the bottom of a basic highlighter. This feeling penetrated my thigh, and I could feel it deep in my tissue long after we had gotten back home. We checked the Jeep for any damage, and not a single piece of evidence was found. I was terrorized by some sort of evil presence for several years from ages 9 to 12. Every night was hell for me. It gave me so much anxiety that I missed 2 years of school. My cat and even my family affirmed that something was definitely amiss in that house. All of my family admits to seeing the same shadow man in the hallway and feeling horrible, mentally, physically, and emotionally, in that house. While my family each had their thick, locked bedroom doors, my bedroom was in the loft, overhanging the living room, without any sort of door, just wide open. So my cat and I would hear every little noise all night. It was extremely noisy and active. My cat would whine and sprint around all night, looking over the living room from my bedroom. This was extremely unusual behavior for him. The chandelier would aggressively swing and jingle. The fridge, dishwasher, and kitchen cabinets would slowly or quickly creak open and shut. The fridge would sometimes open loudly and not shut at all. I would peek over into the living room and see the fridge light glaring on in the kitchen. I'd hear the front door handle jiggle, and the lock sound like a key was being inserted inside. And I would hear a clock loudly ticking all night long. We had no clock like this, and the ticking would disappear in the day. Dining room chairs would scoot along on the hardwood floor. My cat's dry food bag would sound like it was being dug into while he was sitting right next to me. And there were static noises on the TV, like when you turn an older style TV on and off, the static makes a quick click sound. Just all sorts of unexplainable things terrorized me each and every night. Bedtime was the worst time for me. Nearly the second my family locked their doors for the night, it would all start up again like clockwork. I lived in a pretty abusive household and strongly believed this spirit fed off my mother's negative energy. My family would not allow me to knock on their doors or wake them up for help. I would just get screamed at, so it was totally off limits to knock on their door, no matter how deeply disturbed I was each night. Just a couple of months before we moved out, my mother fell into a diabetic ketoacidosis coma. She nearly died, but somehow survived. She woke up a completely different person. Not nearly as angry, mean, or aggressive. She lost a lot of her memory and turned into someone totally unrecognizable from the ugly woman we all once knew. She went from caring way too much to not caring about anything at all, from being way too mean and angry to way too lax and chill. After her coma, we moved out of that house shortly after. The very second we moved to a new house, everything seemed to stop almost simultaneously. Even my cat's bizarre nighttime behaviors came to a complete halt after we moved, and he returned to normal. It's been almost 20 years, and I still can't explain what happened during that time. I would like to believe it was just an overactive imagination, or perhaps even a trauma response, but it was just all too real. I missed 2 years of school because I couldn't sleep at night, and my anxiety went through the roof, from insomnia to the point of it physically affecting me, giving me horrible stomach and bladder pains and nausea. Those physical symptoms all completely stopped right after we left the house. And the fact that my family and cat also saw and felt very weird and unexplainable things makes me believe it definitely wasn't just my imagination. When I was 7, my younger sister 4 at the time went missing. My father was petrified. Our whole neighborhood was searching, and the police were already involved. I went across the street and a couple of blocks down to our babysitter's to see if she was there. She wasn't. As I began walking home, a boy my age came up to me. He was really friendly and nice. Boys my age weren't usually nice to me, and I was confused as to why I felt so relaxed around this stranger. I asked him who he was, and he said he was in my math class. I was stumped. In my grade, we had the same class and teacher the whole day, so it's not like students would join us for different subjects or we would get a different teacher, like in high school. But he insisted he was in my math class. I remember he had shaggy black hair, and he was smiling a lot. It was really calming walking with him. I told him about my sister missing, and he told me to check the couches on the stairs landing. I asked how he knew about the couches in the building, and he said he had been playing in there before too. The couches were a stack of 2 that someone had left on the very top floor landing in our apartment, and we were always told not to go near them because they could fall and hurt us. The way they were stacked, one couch was on its legs, and the other couch was upside down with the back of the couch against the legs. We walked back to the apartment building, and I opened the front door for the kid, and he was gone. Just gone. He wasn't walking away. He wasn't down the block. He wasn't standing across the street. I was talking to him just as I reached for the door, and then he wasn't there. I walked up to my dad, and I told him to check the couches. He insisted he already had, but I kept bugging him. He checked again, and this time found my sister wedged in the crack between the legs and the back of the couches. She couldn't yell for help or hear anyone looking for her. She was totally fine after. When I was approximately 4 or 5 years old, I lived in Independence, Missouri, on a dead-end road. I lived with my 4 older siblings and both of our parents. Our house was about midway along the road. We had one neighbor who lived way up the hill, and his house was set up close to the main road. He had a set of dog runs behind our property, but rarely had any dogs in the runs. The rest of the area was surrounded by woods. The reason I'm explaining this is to clarify that there was no light source that would have come in through the back of the house. My dad was a carpenter and had built a bedroom in the basement of our small house where my parents slept. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs. My 3 brothers had the bedroom on the northwest side at the back left corner of the house, and my sister and I shared a bedroom that was also on the left side of the house. But our room was between my brother's bedroom and the living room. My bedroom didn't have a door, but my brother's bedroom did. The boys always closed their door at night. The head of my bed was placed up against the boys' bedroom wall, directly in front of the open door. As I lay in bed, I faced the dirty clothes closet, which also had no door. At the ceiling of the closet was the attic access panel. One night, I was fast asleep until I heard a creepy noise. The noise woke me up, but I didn't know what it was. I whispered to my sister. She didn't respond, so I sat up. I could see her in bed, still fast asleep, so I lay back down. I heard the creepy noise again. It was the sound of creaking. You know that sound wood makes when it's snugly fitted together and is being separated? That screeching, creaking sound. I listened and was able to place the noise. It was coming from inside the closet. I lay there terrified, knowing there was no reason for that sound to come from that closet. I just wanted to add that I sleep on my side. I always have, and I have never suffered from sleep paralysis or any other sleeping disorders. I was wide awake. Remember, I had called out to my sister earlier and had to sit up to see her lying fast asleep, so I know it wasn't a vivid dream or a sleep paralysis episode. I lay there, terrified, waiting to see what was going on, when I noticed that the shadows in the closet started getting darker. The area around the attic access panel seemed to stay the same, but the area where the panel was definitely getting darker. There was something slowly descending from the attic. I was so scared that I had my blankets pulled up to my nose. But I still watched as this thing continued to come more clearly into view. The best way I can describe what I was seeing was a black cloaked figure hovering and descending from my attic. It looked like an old monk's cloak, or how you'd picture what the Grim Reaper wears. However, at 4 to 5 years of age, I had no idea what a monk even was, let alone the Grim Reaper. I saw no feet or hands, just the sleeves of the cloak. I watched until the head finally came into view. Then I saw a red glow coming out from under the hood. At that point, I pissed the bed in utter fear, pulled the blankets over my head, and thought, if it's going to kill me, I don't want to see it coming. After a while, when nothing happened to me, I eventually fell back asleep. When I woke up the next morning, I rushed to find my parents and tried to tell them what I saw. My mom and dad gave me the standard lines, "Oh, you just had a bad dream, and it was just a trick of the light." I figured, well, they are my parents, and I trust them, so I let it go, and never talked about it again. Many years later, I was babysitting with a friend. I was about 16 years old at the time. We started talking about paranormal experiences we'd had in our past. She told me a story exactly like mine, except she had a walk-in closet in her bedroom with the attic access. She had seen the exact same figure come out of her closet, and she was about the same age I had been when I saw it. I was stunned. I started discreetly asking other people without using any leading questions or statements or giving them any clues as to what I was looking for. I didn't tell them about my story or my friend's story. I just asked if they ever saw anything creepy when they were kids and let them tell me their own tales. Shockingly, several other people experienced this same phenomenon. Now, as I think back on it, some things really stand out to me. All my siblings used to be normal, loving kids, except my sister, according to my mom and my oldest brother, lol. But shortly after that thing showed up, my middle brother started getting extremely violent, irrational, and abusive. He developed a cancerous brain tumor in the core of his brain and died at age 17. My other brother's facial looks dramatically changed, to the point I noticed it right away. It was like he went to bed my best friend and closest brother and woke up a stranger the next morning. After my middle brother died, my other brother, the one whose looks had changed, well, his personality drastically changed as much as his looks had. He also got extremely violent and just seemed like he'd turned into a completely different person. My sister also became cruel, but she ran away from home at the age of 16, so I couldn't catch any personality changes in her. She was 7 years older than me, so we weren't ever that close to begin with. I didn't see my older sister again until I was about 17 years old. Although, as an adult, I had a terrible feeling that if given the chance, she would try to poison me or hurt me in any other way she could. Whenever she tried to hug me or touch me, I'd get weird, creepy, heebie-jeebie vibes. My oldest brother and I were the only ones who turned out mostly okay. My brother remembered me telling them what I had seen that night. He also seems to feel like it was a demon or death himself. When I was a boy growing up on the west side of Detroit, Michigan, I observed a number of scary experiences. I grew up in a very normal ranch-style home on a very safe, leafy street where children could play freely and without worry. You might even call this neighborhood boring. In those days, there was a tremendous amount of diversity in the neighborhood. It was filled with immigrants from wide varied places like Macedonia, Poland, Lebanon, Mexico, and other far-flung countries. There were no apartment complexes, and instead everybody owned their own freestanding house. This is typical of Detroit, which is very car-centric and suburban. The neighbor, an old American guy, used to tinker around on an old Packard in his garage. Anyways, you get the picture. The houses were in the mid-century style, and not very old. In fact, our house only had one previous owner. But that didn't mean it wasn't haunted. Sometimes at night, I would have trouble falling asleep. I was a very energetic 5-year-old, so I assumed that wasn't uncommon for a kid like me. What is uncommon, however, is the reason behind my sleeplessness. I could feel a growing presence inside of my house, but this presence didn't originate in the house. It didn't linger there during the day. It came from outside, and it only came when it got dark out. I said that the presence was growing because it revealed itself to me slowly over time. It began with what I'll describe as a heartbeat, an ambient, slowly thumping rhythm that I could feel when it came into our house. Kind of like a Doppler effect. It's difficult to explain the sound and feeling. But when I began to feel this thing, I would get so filled with fright that I would immediately jump out of bed and run down the hall into my parents' room. From the safety of their room, I felt it slowly stalk around the house. I never saw what it looked like. I didn't want to see it. But at night after night, over the course of a month, it began to grow more brave. I could feel it as it moved around the house, and I could sense where it was in proximity to me by the strength of the Doppler effect heartbeat feeling. Each night it got closer, and the thumping was stronger and louder. Sometimes it walked up to the door, and I could feel it looking into the room. But I was too afraid to look back. I hid my head. Then, the night finally came when I saw it. That night began similarly to the other nights that came before. I went to bed, and found myself awake a few hours later, during a time when everybody else was asleep, and the only sound was the ticking of the kitchen clock. And just like usual, I felt it enter the house, and I ran into my parents' room and jumped into their bed. And, just like so many nights before, I felt it make its way down the hall. Normally it would stop before their door, but that night, it walked into my parents' bedroom and revealed itself to me. The thing was a pulsating mass of green energy. It was expanding and contracting like a heartbeat, the beating that I could feel, both as a child and as an adult. I would describe it the same way. Squiggly green lines that were going everywhere. But it was still walking upright on two legs, in the shape of a man, such as it was. When it walked into the room, it had to duck its head to enter. It must have been 7 feet tall. When it entered the room, the heartbeat feeling was so overwhelming, I had to cover my ears with my hands. It began to spread and quickly covered the whole area of the room, and it was gone. The night I finally saw the green man was my last encounter with it. In my preface, I said that I hesitated to call it a ghost, but I'm not well versed enough in the paranormal to know what it was. It never did come back. Maybe a listener can shed some light on the nature of this entity. Again, I don't want to call it a ghost, but I don't know the explanation. I have other stories that have happened to me over the years, up until I was in college, but none compared to the horror of the green man that came to me as a child. This story happened when I was about 5 or 6 years old. I'm an only child, and we live in a 2-story house. On the first floor, we have the living room and the kitchen, while the second floor has the bedrooms. On this particular day, my parents and I slept in the living room to watch movies. My mom preferred this setup, so she wouldn't be afraid to cook early in the morning, as they had to wake up at 2 a.m. because of my dad's job. I woke up alone in the living room, hearing sounds from the kitchen. Knowing it was my mom, I planned to continue sleeping since it was still early. I rolled over in bed, turning from facing the wall to facing the stairs leading to the second floor. The living room was dark except for the light coming from the kitchen. As I squinted my eyes, trying to clarify if I was really seeing something, I noticed a white figure floating at the top of the stairs. At first, I thought I was just hallucinating since I had just woken up. However, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could clearly see a woman dressed in a white gown that reached her ankles. Her black hair covered her entire face, and her skin was incredibly pale. I froze in fear, not knowing who or what she was. The longer I looked at her, the more I noticed she was slowly descending the stairs. I could see her feet taking steps, but they weren't touching the stairs. There was a clear gap between her feet and the steps. As she came closer, I felt cold sweat on the back of my neck and hands. When she was just 2 steps away from the bottom, I bolted from the living room to the kitchen, crying to my mom. When I told my mom about it, she didn't believe me, thinking I had just had a bad dream. However, this kept happening, to the point where I didn't want to sleep in my room on the second floor or even change clothes there. When I was 16 years old, I asked my mom why we had holy water in the house. She explained that I had been constantly crying and seemed really afraid of the house. So she went to the church to get holy water, hoping it would drive away whatever I was seeing. I also remember my cousin telling me she had to accompany me to my room to change clothes because I kept insisting there was a woman on the second floor. If my mom got angry at me for not going upstairs alone, I would cry nonstop, insisting the woman was there. So someone always had to accompany me to the second floor. Eventually, we stopped sleeping on the second floor altogether and only went up to change clothes. We moved after 5 months to my father's hometown. However, after this incident, I started to constantly hear, feel, and see things around me, which at some points in my life almost drove me crazy. This happened almost 20 years ago. My daughter had been in a coma for months with severe neurological trauma. After waking up and being medically cleared, we were moved to an inpatient rehab that provided separate housing for parents of patients. She was 17 months old, and I stayed inside the rehab facility as often as I could with her, sleeping on chairs, etc., when staff allowed it. There was one charge nurse in particular who didn't allow parents to stay, so I had to walk to the parent housing and sleep there for the evening. It was a much older dorm-style, open bunk room with probably 12 beds. I was the only parent who had stayed that evening, as I couldn't afford a hotel. It was 3 a.m., and I woke up to a noise in the area around me, an eerie scratching sound, but it was all around me. Above me, below me, in front of me, extremely hard to pinpoint. The only light was coming in from the street light outside, illuminating the ground in front of the windows at the end of the beds. Directly in front of my bed, a small figure stood up. It was a small girl, dark hair, and extremely frail looking. I remember knowing that at that moment she was not real alive. You could just tell. There was no moment where I thought she was a patient who had wandered up. Although it's a locked facility, there was absolutely no confusion that I was looking at a living, breathing child. She stared at me for what seemed like hours, and I couldn't speak. She put her little hand on the rail at the end of my bed, and then, in front of my eyes, she disappeared. I was not asleep. I initially had written it off as my mind being overstressed, but I mentioned it to a day nurse that I had developed a friendship with, and she told me I was not the first parent to relay this story. In fact, she described the little girl to me without me mentioning features at all. I currently live with my fiancée and her 5-year-old daughter, Gilly. I have lived with them for the past 3 to 4 years. Prior to our current home, we lived in an apartment in another area close to where we live now. We never really thought much of the apartment. It seemed fairly modern to us, and we never had any uneasy feelings while living there. However, after the first year, my fiancé's daughter, who was about 3 or 4 at that time, began talking to an imaginary friend named Emily. Since we both believe in the paranormal and how susceptible children are to it, we began to keep that in mind whenever Gilly would talk about or play with Emily. It soon got to the point that not a day would go by without Gilly mentioning Emily. Finally, one night, while we were driving, I asked Gilly jokingly, "All right, Gilly, I'm just gonna throw it out there. Is Emily a ghost?" She laughed and said, "No, she's my friend." Immediately after her response, a cow appeared in the middle of the road, causing me to violently jerk the wheel into the oncoming lane. Now this may have been a coincidence, and we ended up chalking it up to that, until we began to notice other strange things happen at the apartment. One night while we were asleep, I awoke to an icy cold press on the tip of my nose. I reached for my fiancée to see if she was playing a trick on me, but she was fast asleep. I even checked her hands to see if she may have accidentally touched me while moving, but her hands were warm. Another night I was watching TV in the living room, when my fiancée nervously called me into the bedroom. I walked in and saw the TV on, but nothing out of the ordinary. She said she was sleeping, and all of a sudden the TV turned on by itself. This began to happen quite often after that. One time while I was sitting in the living room, out of the corner of my eye, I saw who I thought was my fiancée walk into the bedroom, turn on the light, and begin to put away laundry. Or so I thought. After a while I called to her and asked if she needed any help, since it seemed like it was taking longer than usual. She asked what I was talking about. However, her voice was not coming from the bedroom. My fiancée was in the kitchen, and said she had been in there the entire time. Perhaps the most interesting incident happened late one night, when I heard Dilly making a strange noise in her bedroom. I rushed into the room and found her crying, gasping for air, with a very unusual cough. She was crying and saying her chest was hurting. It turned out to be croup cough, which I had never heard of before that incident. That being said, I ran into my bedroom to wake up my fiancée and tell her that I needed help. After we calmed Gilly down and put her back to bed, she told me that right before I burst into the door, she saw a little girl in a white dress with blonde hair open the door with a look of surprise and worry on her face. To this day, we both believe that it was Emily trying to warn her friend that she was in trouble. After these incidents began occurring, I did a little research on the building. Though our apartment seemed to be very modern, the home itself had been built in the late 1800s. Unfortunately, this was the extent of my findings. However, the history itself explains a lot. One last, quick story about Gilly. This doesn't involve her ghostly counterpart. However, it is still quite interesting. Last summer, when she was about 4 or 5, we were staying at a hotel on vacation. We had just tucked her into bed, read her stories, and said good night. She replied, "Okay, I'm going to die now." Shocked, we both looked at her and told her that was not a nice thing to say, and she should not repeat it. In a nonchalant tone, she replied, "Oh, I was just joking. Besides, I would just go up to heaven anyway." Mind you, we are not a religious family, and up until that point, we had not really discussed such things with her. Nevertheless, her comment was both intriguing and freaky at the same time. We asked her how she knew this, and she continued, "Well, that's what happened last time. Gerald came down and took the stone off my head, and then we both flew up to heaven." We began to ask about Gerald, and she answered, "Oh, he's the one that helped me go to heaven. He's got wings." I stayed up there for a while. Then I decided to come back down here and live with you guys. After composing ourselves, we again said good night and all went to sleep. On the way home, we drove past the cemetery, and Gilly said excitedly, "That's one of the stones," pointing to a tombstone. "That's the kind of stone he helped get off my head." She also would talk about her old family and how she had children who did not want her, and so they kicked her out. She also stated that she had to bury one of them, as well as her mother. Though the frequency of her comments about her past lives have diminished, she still occasionally will mention them. This story happened when I was 10. I was home alone with my brother, and he had to use the bathroom while I was in the living room. While I was waiting for him to come back and watching a movie on the TV, I heard a knock on the window. I looked over, but nothing was there, so I thought it was the TV from the video that was playing. That was until I heard the knock again, but this time from my bedroom. I stood up and walked down the hallway to my bedroom. Then I heard footsteps running behind me. I looked back and saw someone who looked like me, but it wasn't me. I screamed and sprinted towards my brother's room and locked myself in there. Later, after my brother got out of the bathroom, he came to his room since he heard me scream and his door slammed shut. He unlocked it with the key he had and came inside. I told him everything, but he didn't believe me. Now, 7 years later, I don't know if what I saw was a hallucination or if it was real, but I know what I saw.